Now, to delve a bit more into the subject of Honduras and all that's been taking place there, I'm joined by Grahame Russell, the Director of Rights Action. Thanks so much for joining us today, Grahame.
Thank you very much.
So a national strike was to be held on Thursday and Friday, but since then we've seen these large demonstrations continue into the weekend, including today. Why are they protesting?
Well, in a sense, there's been 10 years of protests that are ongoing. In the short and narrow sense, there's protests that have been going on over the last few weeks with a heavy concentration on Thursday and Friday and through this weekend because of the latest sort of privatization plans of the government headed by Juan Orlando Hernandez, which is to privatize the health and the public health and public education sectors. But these privatization schemes are just the latest of a series of sort of pro-global business, pro-global investor privatization policies that the Honduran governments have been implementing since the military-backed coup of 2009. And there's been protests going on throughout the past 10 years on a regular basis.
Now, we've been seeing mobilizations and organizations, specifically the Partido Libre of former President Manuel Zelaya, refer to this government as illegitimate. And this began before the elections, and of course, protesters were out in full force this week. They were out in full force claiming fraud during the elections, after the elections, and this week they're continuing to say that the government is an illegitimate dictatorship. What are they referring to when they speak about impunity in the country?
There's a very important and brief timeline to understand, and that is that there was a military coup in June of 2009 that was backed by the United States and Canada that ousted Honduras' last democratically elected government. That of the entire government of President Zelaya was forcibly ousted by the military. Since then, there's been three sets of corrupt, fraudulent, and very violent elections in November 2009, November 2013, November 2017. And these elections, as I said, were fraudulent. Widespread fraud was discovered. They were extremely violent. Many opposition party members were killed. But each time these elections occurred, they were legitimized and claimed to be democratic by the United States and by Canada, and then soon by other actors in the international community. And so these corrupt, violent governments kept coming back into power through these fraudulent election processes. And that's what we have today. This is the second government headed up illegally by Juan Orlando Hernandez, who came into power through widespread fraud in November of 2017. And since then, there's been just another outpouring of protests across the country against the illegitimate government and against the privatization global business policies of this government that are being implemented through violence and corruption across the country.
Now, through the works of your organization, Rights Action, I know you've seen firsthand the government's handling of the environment, of indigenous land rights, and the rights of those communities when it comes to mining in Honduras. What can you tell us about how these things are looking on the environmental justice and indigenous rights front?
Devastating. As I said, the roots of some of these issues go back to before the coup in 2009, but by any measure, the US and Canadian-backed coup in June of 2009 took all the social and human rights indicators and threw them down the toilet at the same time as the government was implementing its bumper sticker was Honduras open for business. So they increased they increased access by international companies into the sectors of mining, hydroelectric dams, tourism, sugarcane production, banana production, and the maquiladora sweatshop sector. In every one of these sectors, there's been an increase in forced violent evictions of people from their own lands, of human rights violations and killings of community leaders, and then the widespread violation of human rights in every one of these sectors of the economy that this government is promoting And every one of these sectors is dominated by businesses and investors in the international community that are turning a blind eye to the corruption and repression, turning a blind eye to the human rights violations, and getting on with sometimes very profitable business.
Absolutely. And we've been showing images of what looks like police repression in the streets, as well as images of people leaving for this migrant caravan that's headed for the United States. Would you call what we're seeing a crisis? And what do you make of international media coverage, which for some time now has provided quite extensive coverage of the political situation in Venezuela and last year in Nicaragua? Why aren't we hearing more about Honduras?
There's a bunch of questions in there, but let me just briefly comment on them as best I can. If Whereas we discussed earlier how these protests are against the privatization of the public health and education systems, the one sector of Honduran society that's not being privatized and where it's not suffering any cutbacks is the so-called security sector. So even as this government is cutting back on everything that has to do with the well-being of the Honduran population, like health and education, access to microcredit, etc., they are not cutting back on military and police spending. And some international observers are referring to Honduras as a failed state. It's not a failed state. It's a very violent state that is in service of the economic interests of the ruling elites in Honduras and their international business partners in the sectors that I mentioned. And then so for all the reasons that we're seeing on the news today, the violent crackdown by the police and the military against Hondurans, for the most part, peacefully protesting against the privatization schemes, the corruption of the government, including the fact that drug trafficking has infiltrated into most branches of the government. These are all the very reasons why more people are forced to flee Honduras today than in any time in its recent history, going back to the early 80s, when Honduras was governed by a US-backed military dictatorship all through the 80s. That the numbers of people fleeing every year in the tens of thousands, if not more, is directly related to this 10-year situation. Now, you can call it a crisis, or you can say that repression has become normalized. Corruption has become normalized. Exploitation of the people and forced evictions have become normalized. All of the worst aspects of Honduran society are so normalized, it's hard to call them a crisis. It's almost as if real democracy and respect for human rights would be the crisis to this very violent, repressive situation in the country. And then to finish off with the role of the media, I pay a lot of attention to the role of the media in Canada and the United States. And I think that for the most part, our media has done a very sort of misleading job with respect to not just covering the caravans, but what are the underlying causes of why so many people are forced into joining these refugee caravans or just fleeing on their own across Mexico to try and get into the United States. And I think the media is doing this because the problem being in Honduras is being created by US and Canadian policy. The US has a very deep and dark history supporting very corrupt, repressive governments in Honduras going back into the 1800s. Canada, certainly since the coup in 2009, is playing sort of a front seat role with the United States. And it is our public policy that is very much empowering and enabling the very situation that's causing so many people to flee. So if and when our media addresses something like the caravan and the suffering of the people forced to flee, our media is not delving into what are the underlying causes, because I think it would expose very sort of corrupt and sort of selfish Canadian and American public policy at play.
Thank you so much, Graham. I think you answered my last question, so I'm going to let you end there, which was about the role of the U.S. and Canadian government in Honduras. We'd love to speak to you again and others that you organize with there on the ground in Honduras. We've been speaking to Grahame Russell. He is the Director of Rights Action.